Tonight, I am delighted to introduce our guest speaker, Frances Seymour, who's going to tell us how trees affect climate from Brazil to our own backyards. Frances is an expert on tropical forests and climate change. She's the lead author of Why Forests, Why Now? The Science, Economics, and Policies of Tropical Forests and Climate Change. She's also one of the foremost authorities on sustainable development. Currently, she's a distinguished senior fellow at the World Resources Institute, a global environmental think tank charged with protecting the planet and improving people's lives. There, she conducts research and is senior advisor for major forest and climate initiatives, as well as senior advisor and board chair to private foundations and green initiatives in architecture. There's much more to Frances, but you get the picture. Frances knows of what she speaks. Frances is also our neighbor and a good friend of our village. She and her husband, Mike Kopetsky, live their passion for protecting the environment. Their home is a model for sustainability coupled with great design. As we learned to our delight when their home was on our house tour in 2019. So please join me in warmly welcoming our good friend and our distinguished guest speaker, Frances Seymour.
Thank you, Carolyn, and thanks to everybody for being here tonight, and to any of you who will be listening to this and the recording in the future. I was asked to talk about what I do, and as Carolyn has mentioned, it's primarily focused on tropical forests. And so the way I tried to frame this is talking about how forests and trees affect the climate from Brazil to your backyard. And these images are the Amazon River and the Potomac River. And try to draw some linkages there, focusing mostly on what I do professionally, but ending with just a few sort of fun facts about forests and trees in our neighborhoods. So what I'm going to try to do is keep my remarks to about 30 minutes so that there's plenty of time to have a discussion about what's of most interest to those of you who are participating tonight. So the outline of what I'm going to talk about is to sort of tick through these various assertions. One, that forests everywhere, but particularly in the tropics, provide a very wide range of goods and services. That tropical forests especially are essential to global climate stability because of their ability to store carbon. But they also affect the climate in other ways that most people don't realize. Unfortunately, tropical deforestation is proceeding at a high and accelerating rate. And I'll say a little bit about why that's happening and what can be done about it, and then close with just a few brief fun facts about forests and trees affecting urban climates, including the one that we live in here in Washington, D.C. So, I mean, one of the things that attracted me to studying tropical forests and a lot of other people is the really cool wildlife, the charismatic megafauna and all the biological diversity. But forests everywhere, have cool critters, as we know here in DC as well. But the tropical forests are especially rich in biological diversity, and it's estimated that probably 70% or more of the species on the earth, on the land, are found in tropical forests. But it's also important to remember that tropical forests are directly important to human beings and rural livelihoods. And so just quickly ticking around clockwise from the northeast corner, a lot of people get their fuel wood and charcoal from the forest for cooking their food. A lot of people get their income from the timber industry, either for logging, for local construction, or for sale on the market. Other people get a lot of important nutrients, especially fats and proteins, from harvesting bushmeat, the wild species from the forest. And finally, especially for women, harvesting and processing non-timber forest products, nuts and seeds and honey and that sort of thing, is an important part of women's livelihoods. And at the research center I used to work at, there was a big study done across tropical countries that estimated that more than 20% on average of household incomes in and around forests comes from the harvest of these wild products. But unfortunately, they're almost never included in national accounts. So they're invisible when, capital city economic planners decide to replace a forest with a plantation or something. When those livelihoods go away, they tend not to be counted. But in addition to the goods that forests provide, they also provide a lot of ecosystem services. And these are even less visible to economic policymakers often because they're not traded in the market. And so again, starting in the northeast corner of this slide, what I'll say a little bit more about later is that forests actually play quite a strong role in moderating hydrology, not only on the surface runoff, but also in terms of generating rainfall. If forests interact with clouds to both create cloud cover, but also to precipitate rain, both nearby and far away, which is, of course, is very important to agriculture. Moving around clockwise again, forests also provide important watersheds that regulate the hydrology for example, the water that fills the dams behind hydroelectric installations. So it's important for energy, but also those dams often supply irrigation water for agriculture or drinking water for municipal areas. So really important to all those things. Forests harbor pollinators, not only bees, but bats and birds, and often crop fields near forests have higher productivity because of that pollination, that they're nearby forests than crop fields that are further away from the forest edge. And then forests are also important in mitigating the risk of disaster. This is an image of a major landslide. You see the little tiny person in the lower right-hand corner, you get a sense of how big that is. Keeping the forests on the hillsides is a good way to prevent landslides, but also like mangrove forests are an important way of preventing damage from storms or also tsunami waves. So for all those services, forests are important. But not to forget, forests are also important, like spiritually and psychologically. And I think across cultures and religions, big old trees sort of inspire reverence in various ways. There's a lot of symbolism in cosmologies about the roles of trees. And there's also, a lot of research about how you're just psychologically better off after a walk in the forest. And I think there's some research on people who live in areas with more trees feel 10 years younger, and that becomes more important over time. So, trees are important in lots of ways. But what I'm here to talk about is the specific interactions between trees and forests and climate. And so first, just sort of the basic, dynamic of it. The reason forest loss is so important for global climate change is that standing forests, harbor just literally, hundreds of tons per hectare of carbon locked up in the trees and branches, but also down in the soil. And certain soils like peat soils hold a lot of carbon. But when that forest begins to get degraded or is burned or, otherwise is cleared, all of that carbon that's locked up in the trees and soils is released into the atmosphere essentially instantaneously. I mean, some of the wood is conserved in like furniture or something, but that's a tiny little, a portion. And so it's a major source of global carbon emissions, which I'll show you a little bit more about in a minute. But that's not all. That in addition to that big pulse of carbon, you also lose the ongoing sequestration that mature forests continue to provide. When I was studying ecology, 40 years ago as a university student, there was a sense that mature forests were in equilibrium and stopped sequestering carbon. But that actually turns out not to be true, that large trees in mature forests continue to accumulate carbon in vegetation and soils. So when you lose the forest, you use that sink, but that's not all. Usually when a forest is removed, it's replaced by a high emitting activity. Like one of the highest emitting activities is cattle production, for example, because of all the methane that cows produce. So you're going from an active carbon sink to an active carbon source when you remove a forest. And even if you let that forest grow back, so moving over to the lower left-hand corner, it takes 100 years or more to get back to where you started through the slow accumulation of carbon into the trees and soils as trees grow back. So it's a pretty catastrophic event when you lose a forest just from the global climate implications. So just a sense of what this looks like from space. We can now watch deforestation from space and increasingly calculate the carbon emissions associated with that. This is an image of the island of Borneo, which spans Malaysia and Indonesia. And it's what it looks like when the peat forests of Indonesia burn, which happens, every few years during an El Nino event. And the clouded area in the lower right-hand corner is over this vast area of peat swamps that were cleared during the Suharto era and drained for an ill-fated rice cultivation project. And it's just very flammable. And whenever there's an extended dry season, it's easy to ignite. And when it does burn, you can see a blip in the global climate emission measurements because there's so much carbon as well as particulates being poured into the air. So we see those particulates from space, but they're associated with lots of carbon emissions as well. So to give you a sense of the magnitude of what this means is that if tropical deforestation were a country, its carbon emissions would be greater than those of the European Union, second only to the United States and China. These numbers are almost a decade out of date, but the relative positions in the league tables are about the same. We wouldn't think about trying to save the climate change problem without China and the United States, and we can't think about it without solving the tropical deforestation problem either. Now, I mentioned that it's not just the carbon cycle through which tropical forests affect the climate, or any forest affects the climate. It turns out there's a whole generation of research that's enabled now by both remote sensing technology to measure forest cover change combined with advanced computing technology that's enabling scientists to directly measure and then model the magnitude of some of these impacts. So one of them that we've known about for a long time is the effect of surface albedo. In other words, the amount of incoming sunlight into the atmosphere that's reflected back out into space. And it turns out that, like, if you're up in Arctic areas, boreal forests, having more forest cover actually makes you warmer because the dark green of the leaves absorbs more of the light than the white snow cover that would otherwise be there. But in the tropics, it's often the opposite because the tropics have cloud cover over the forest and the clouds reflect the sunlight back into space. Another process is so-called surface roughness, where when wind is blowing over a surface, having a rough tree canopy cover kind of mixes up the air and sends some of the heat more up into the upper atmosphere. So it doesn't send it out into space, but it does move it away from the Earth's surface. And so that has a cooling effect. And so when you remove the forest, you end up having warmer, drier conditions. And finally, and probably most significantly, is the effect of forests through the mechanism of evapotranspiration, where, when rain falls on a forest, some of the water gets evaporated directly off the surface of the leaves, but forests also draw moisture up through the roots from underground and transpire it through the stomata, on the leaves. And this is a giant air conditioner, which has, an incredible effect of circulating this heat, again, from low on the surface of the Earth up into the atmosphere. And recent science suggests that if you add all these effects together, that the value of tropical forests in cooling the surface of the Earth is like 30% higher than if we just account for the carbon effect alone. So tropical forests are really important for cooling the whole planet, as well as for cooling, cooling any particular place. So in general, if you remove a forest, you get warmer, drier conditions, and you also end up with less moderating forces on the overall temperature. And so what does that mean? Well, what we have happening now is a combination of the effects of global climate change on forests. So, the whole planet is heating up. And then these other effects that are affecting the climate from the removal of the forests and trees. And so the forests themselves are becoming increasingly vulnerable to extreme events that have been made more frequent and severe from climate change itself. One of the things that World Resources Institute, my home organization, does is every year this platform called the Global Forest Watch releases annual data on how much tree cover loss we've incurred in the previous year based on satellite imagery analysis. And this year, it was really shocking how much of the forest loss in 2020 was due to the effects of climate change on forests, like hurricanes flattening forests in Central America or beetles infesting forests in Germany. And in this image on this slide, this is an image of the Pantanal wetland in Brazil. And the Pantanal is the world's largest tropical wetland. and something like 30% of it burned last year. I mean, it's a wetland. It's hard to burn a wetland, but because of an extended drought, and some degradation, it became more flammable, and a huge amount of it burned. So this is a problem. Second, we are seeing changes in rainfall patterns. There's a whole series of papers that have come out trying to measure just how much rainfall patterns within Brazil have changed as the frontier of the Amazon rainforest has been chipped away. And as you can imagine, changes in rainfall patterns have significant implications for agricultural productivity. And these effects, a precipitation shed can be hundreds of miles from, where the forest is and where the impact on the rainfall is. And there's some science that suggests that this same effect may link the Congo Basin forests with like the Nile Basin. So, agriculture in Egypt depends on keeping the trees in the ground, in the DRC. So all kinds of connections at regional scales. But important at the local level is the impact on local temperature extremes, because forests everywhere help to moderate whatever temperature is being experienced, whether extreme cold or extreme heat. And so with forest loss, you get not only the background increase in temperature from climate change, but it's amplified by the increase in temperature from the local effects of forest loss. And there are places on the planet that have already warmed more than 2 degrees Celsius because of the loss of forests, not because of global climate change. And when you think about it, this is going to have, or is already having, important implications for agriculture, because our soybean crops are optimized for a certain temperature range. And if it gets too hot, during the day, you lose some of your crops. And there's already, evidence of decreases in productivity because of that extreme heat. Similarly, for human health, the number of hours you can work outside during the day starts to shrink when, the maximum temperatures go up. And so it's a public health issue. So anyway, all kinds of implications about the changing climate, that interactions between global climate change, forests, and these non-carbon pathways. So here's the bad news. This is a bar chart released by Global Forest Watch in March, showing the estimates of tropical primary forest loss over the last 20 years. And this is based on satellite data. And you can see that it's held pretty steady, with some spikes, and actually starting to tick up a bit, which is really alarming, because we've been throwing all kinds of things at this problem, trying to solve it, and we're losing. It's continuing to go up. And this is, these are areas that are like the size of Belgium or, the Netherlands. I mean, they're big areas of primary tropical forest loss. And these forests are the most carbon rich and the most biodiversity rich forests on the planet. So it's really a problem. Where is this happening? Well, the 800-pound gorilla in tropical deforestation is Brazil. And it's because they have the most forests. I mean, not just the Amazon, but there's the Cerrado and other forests. Most of the deforestation has been happening in the Amazon. But you can see the rankings of the different countries. The main basins: Brazil, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Indonesia, typically have been the top 3. Although in 2020, these are 2019 figures, in 2020, Indonesia actually swapped places with Bolivia, because Indonesia has been doing slightly better in controlling deforestation, and Bolivia has, as you may have seen in the papers, has been burning at a pretty high rate. So these are the numbers, particularly from Brazil. And you can see that Brazil actually did a pretty good job of bringing down deforestation rates under the Lula administration, starting in about 2004. And held steady for a number of years, but then spiked up with some major fires, and then under the Bolsonaro administration, ticking up again. And so some significant losses just last year. And to me, it's pretty striking that in a year of the pandemic, when the whole global economy contracted and everything else slowed down, deforestation ticked up. So that is not good news. So when you think about what's causing this, when we think about tropical deforestation, a lot of people think, oh, it must be logging. Well, logging is still an important driver of degradation, especially in some geographies, certainly the Congo Basin and Papua New Guinea, where the timber industry is still healthy. But in a lot of places, like Indonesia, a lot of the lowland forests have already been logged out a long time ago. So they're actually not, logging is not a major driver. Other people think about, oh, well, the tropical forests are disappearing because it's poor people chipping away with slash and burn agriculture. And yes, some of the forest losses due to that, again, more in the Congo Basin and in some areas. But in fact, in most of the deforestation frontiers, tropical deforestation looks like this. It is for commercial scale agribusiness. In Latin America, cattle and soybeans, the top left and bottom left. In Southeast Asia, it's been mostly palm oil, oil palm plantations and plantations of fast growing timber species like acacia to feed the pulp and paper mills. And so to the extent that this deforestation is being driven by global demand for these commodities, paper and, all the things that palm oil is in, processed foods, cosmetics, soybeans, whether as a direct food or feed for livestock, beef, leather, we are culpable because our demand for those products is what's driving this deforestation. So what can we do about it? Well, I'm just going to tick through these solutions briefly. We can certainly talk about them during the discussion. But this is kind of like what I do when I go to my virtual office every day. First thing we can do is support climate action across all countries and all sectors, because as I hope I've convinced you, forests themselves will fall victim from climate change. And so we got to reduce emissions from fossil fuels and everything else. So it's all hands on deck. We're running out of time. The science says if we don't turn this around in 10 years, we're done. We're toast. So really urgent. Second, we can provide financial incentives to protect forests through international carbon markets. And this is what my book is mostly about in terms of the framework under the Paris Agreement that incentivizes industrialized countries and companies to pay developing countries for their performance in reducing emissions from deforestation. Third is to support efforts to recognize and strengthen Indigenous peoples' rights to forest territories. Indigenous peoples, surprise, surprise, turn out to be really good forest managers, and you can actually see their territories from space because the boundaries are usually, well intact, and outside their territories, more deforestation. Fourth is to pressure companies, especially large corporates with consumer-facing, brands, to get deforestation out of their supply chains for all these commodities: beef, leather, soy, palm oil, paper, cocoa, all those things. And there's a big movement right now with an increasing number of companies, brand names that you would have heard of, the Unilevers and the Mars and the Walmarts, to in fact reach this target of getting deforestation out of their supply chains and stop buying, products that have been produced illegally or through deforestation. In addition, there are options to implement so-called demand-side policies so that consumer economies restrict imports such that only timber and other commodities like this are legally produced. You may have heard of the Lacey Act in the United States, which is our legislation to restrict imports of illegally produced plants and animal materials, and that's been used to restrict the market in the United States. Other legislation, I think, will maybe introduced later this year to extend that for other commodities. Also important to realize is that all the things I've ticked through right now, a lot of them, it's what the international community can do to put a thumb on the scale. But at the end of the day, the fate of the forest, tropical forest, is going to depend on the governments and societies where those forests are in their, domestic policy choices. So I think there's a lot more that we can do to build the science and communicate the economics of the economic benefits of forest protection for domestic agriculture, for domestic public health, for domestic disaster protection, which is above and beyond, the impacts on the global climate or global biodiversity objectives. And I think multilateral development banks like the World Bank can do more in that kind of outreach. And then to transition to the last part of my presentation, the other thing we can do is recruit new constituencies for forest protection, both in the countries themselves, but also globally. So one of the things that World Resources Institute has been doing in the last couple of years is promoting something called Cities for Forests, which is an attempt to recruit new constituencies in urban areas, not only mayors and other city officials, but also urban residents, to help them understand not only the importance of trees in their own immediate environment in the cities, but also how urban well-being anywhere depends on, conservation of tropics everywhere. So the framework that has been developed to communicate this is this shown on this infographic, where we talk about inner forests, in other words, trees or parklands, within a city, and all the benefits those give directly to urban residents, which include, cleaner air, shade, cooling, amenity values of recreation. Turns out more trees in your neighborhood, higher the property values. I've already mentioned the psychological, benefits. So lots of benefits just right there in the city. Then we talk about nearby forests, in other words, outside the city limits, but nevertheless directly impacting the environment and forests. And again, cooling function certainly operates at that scale. Important hydrological functions of controlling flooding and dealing with stormwater control, that sort of thing, as well as sources of timber recreation. And then the far away forests, which I've already talked about at great length, including forests as far away as Brazil or on another continent. So moving to our neighborhood. So what happens when we lose trees around where we live? And I know as we walk the neighborhoods, we see, places that are like this one that have been recently cleared of forests, including some old mature trees. And it's always a little heartbreaking. Well, in the first instance, one of the things we lose is biodiversity. And, we're going to have a big biodiversity event coming up in the next week or two when the cicadas emerge after 17 years. And of course, if you've been reading the Washington Post articles about them, during that 17 years underground, they're feeding off of the roots of trees. And then when they come out for their couple of weeks in the sun, they're up in the trees and the nymphs develop, on the trees and then drop down. So no trees, no cicadas. So just one locally and temporally relevant example. But also just in terms of urban, infrastructure, some of you may know about this special case of Washington, D.C. in terms of its use of trees as part of a green infrastructure strategy. Turns out that in the 70s, through the 1990s, when the population of DC was sort of shrinking and it was kind of a downtime, DC lost 16% of its tree cover, and it was estimated that resulted in a 34% increase in stormwater runoff because you didn't have the trees helping the water infiltrate. And as we know, that leads to these sewer overflow events that dumps sewage into the Potomac River. And DC had to enter into a consent decree with the Environmental Protection Agency to do a better job of controlling that stormwater. And in an innovative plan, they actually chose to address that problem not through exclusively bricks and mortar solution, building more pipelines, but to include so-called green infrastructure, which includes planting more trees, but also like those rain gardens you've seen developed on DC downtown sidewalks in the last couple of years, and more permeable, pavement type interventions. And collectively, all of these are expected to reduce those sewer overflows by 96% by 2030. So it's pretty cool that kind of innovation is happening here in DC. The thing that's most striking to me, and maybe some of you saw this, but this is just a shot from my cell phone because I couldn't get access to the original image, but this map appeared in National Geographic about 2 years ago. And it's literally a heat map of the District of Columbia that was taken, but made from sensors at 3 p.m. on August 28, 2018. And the darker the reddish, the orange color, the hotter the temperature. And the darker the green color, the cooler the temperature. And the amazing thing is that at that moment on that August afternoon, there was a 17-degree spread between the hottest areas and the coolest areas within the District of Columbia. And as you can see, you eyeball it, where are the coolest areas? It's where there are the most trees, Rock Creek Park, and the Palisades. And even comparing, the Palisades to Georgetown, it's just really close by, and yet you get the more tree cover, suddenly it gets a lot cooler. And this is a local example of what I was talking about, in Brazil, of how having tree cover can have an extraordinary cooling effect on where you live. Now, the other thing that probably occurs to you is like, the tree cover tends to be associated with the wealthier, whiter wards in the Northwest DC, and the hotter stuff is, in the other neighborhoods. And so sure enough, that is an issue that DC government officials are trying to address. This is from a news story from 2018 showing how the Department of Transportation had done a inventory of how many empty tree boxes, like the places to plant trees along the road, there were by ward. And you can see that, like in Ward 3, where I live, only 4% of them were empty, whereas in some of the other wards, there was a lot of tree planting to do. So at least at that point, this map was showing where they were prioritizing tree planting, not so much in our neighborhoods where we've already got a lot of trees, but trying to shift and even it up. And this is a worldwide phenomenon where richer areas tend to be more leafy, and the poorer areas or areas with people of color tend to have fewer trees. Let me just close with 2 quick slides. One, a lot of this information in the first part of the presentation is from this book, Why Forests, Why Now? And you can buy it on Amazon, but you can also download the manuscript PDF version for free from the Center for Global Development website. And there's a whole bunch of infographics too, if you're interested in learning more about it. And then I just have to close by what brings it all together, which, as Carol Lynn has already mentioned, is that our house here in the Palisades, my husband Mike and I were very tried to do our best to use only sustainable wood in the house. And also our deck is made from timber from an indigenous community in Guatemala that's produced legally and sustainably. So if you're ever in the neighborhood, stop by, smell Mike's roses, and you see us working in the yard, we'll show you the deck too. Is that our gesture towards helping to protect tropical rainforests. So with that, I will stop talking and really look forward to your comments and any questions and a discussion. Thank you.
Okay, do we have questions? I want to say, just for my part, that that I found this fascinating, enlightening, terrifying, and I'm resisting the urge to run out right now and hug the big giant oak in my backyard to thank it.
Carolyn?
Yes, Peggy.
This is my daughter-in-law, Marilia Magalhães, who's here from Brazil, and she has a question.
Please.
Right.
Okay, hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting. You didn't talk a lot about the political situation, but I'm sure you're horrified. We haven't seen that in Brazil for a while. We have a government that is destroying the environmental institutions from within. So we have this really scary Ministry of Environment that is like making deal with the wood industry. He's forgiving all the fines. He is like firing all the good people who have been working so hard to fight deforestation. And he doesn't have any strategy. It's really like you feel like he's there to dismantle the entire system. And you mentioned Pantanal, and we are horrified to see like animals were burning, and we are all horrified. And the government was just, it was doing nothing, and it was not releasing the money and wouldn't let the firefighters go. So it's a situation that went out of control, and it's very clear that there are like vested interests. So my question is, don't you think that maybe the international community should do something, even if it's like harsher sanctions? And because I don't know what's gonna happen. I mean, I just see that it's getting worse and worse. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. No, it's a great question and a horrible situation. My own expertise is more focused on Indonesia than Brazil, but of course you can't ignore what's going on in Brazil. Let me also preface my remarks by saying, we've seen a little of that in the United States lately in terms of dismantling environmental institutions and, doing favors for industry. So not to be judgmental from the United States to Brazil, but to get to your question, I think the international community is walking a bit of a tightrope because what we've experienced in other countries, and again, I can speak from experience in Indonesia, is that when the international community sort of goes for a hard stick kind of approach, it generates a nationalist response, which often can be counterproductive. And so what I think can be more effective, and you may know more about this than I do in Brazil, is when Brazilian mayors, Amazonian governors, Brazilian agribusiness say to their own federal government, we don't want this, because it's going to cost us access to international markets for the soy and the beef and the leather. Or, the Amazonian mayors or governors saying, we don't want this because we understand, the value of the forest for our economies. And so it's a challenging political calculation to figure out, how to thread that needle. And I think it was an interesting moment to watch last month when President Biden convened heads of state, here in Washington virtually, to talk about climate change. Everybody was watching to see, would the Brazilian delegation come? What would they say? Would the Biden administration offer any incentives or whatever? And I think it's that delicate balance to offer incentives for performance. And this is what I focus on a lot, is this payment for performance for actually reducing deforestation. You only get the money if you actually reduce the deforestation. So I think that's a way to align incentives to change. But as I say, at the end of the day, it's got to be a domestic decision, in the politics of Brazil. And we just need to think carefully about what's the most sophisticated way for the international community to change those incentives in a positive direction without eliciting a nationalist negative response. A great question and horrifying situation. Thank you.
Now you're right, because there is this nationalism that drives me crazy, because I think it's based on ignorance and nobody's doing anything. But you're right. I've heard so many people saying that the Amazon is ours and stuff like that, which is really annoying. But thank you.
Well, going from Brazil to our backyard, there's a question in the chat about what type of trees do best in an urban setting.
Oh, it's a great, I'm sorry that I deleted one of my slides for length, but I found this chart that showed, the different species that are planted here in DC, and oaks were #1. There were also cherry, sycamore, and a couple of others. But I think the key is that in general, native species do best. So that, planting the species, and I love that, as I walk and read the little tags on the new trees planted, in this neighborhood, they are planting, some of the post oaks, which you can also see growing down, by the river, or the sycamores or other things. So I think the first answer is plants that grow in this climate, in this area naturally. And also plenty of research about how trees that, rather than planting just one species, planting a diversity of species. So biodiversity, even in an urban environment, is important, because they're both more resilient, but also then can cultivate some biological diversity. I'm hardly an urban arborist, but these are some of the things I've picked up from colleagues who work on these issues.
Thank you. And Barbara, do you want to voice your question?
Yeah, yes. Francis, I have this very large question, but it relates to your talk, which is that I, as a concerned world citizen, am trying to understand what is really happening with, let's say, the poorest people in the world. For example, a friend of mine is a rural sociologist who worked for many, many years at a major university in California. And he's talked to me a lot about urbanization. And I guess what I don't understand is, what are the different pressures on forests? I mean, for example, it's terrible when people pour into big cities in developing nations that don't have the resources to feed them or give them jobs. On the other hand, it's terrible when poor people tear down forests in order to have, either bush meat or, and I know what you said was that it's agribusiness, just as I think agribusiness is you know, close to evil in our country or very bad and deleterious. So what I'm trying to understand is what's the best kind of fuel and what's the best in country after country, from Bolivia to Indonesia, what should we as a world community and through institutions like the World Bank and the IMF be trying to help the developing world? You know, what is the balance between urbanization and farming and the right kind of fuel to preserve the forests? And I know it's a very big question, but I'm confused, as I say, because I don't know enough about which are the greater threats to the whole world's survival in a harmonious and prosperous way.
Sure. Well, I mean, I can't do justice in a brief answer to what is indeed a sweeping question that people, you know, spend careers and researching and writing books about. I'll just say a couple of things. I think in general, well, first of all, the answer, like to all important questions, it depends on where, because as I mentioned, it's like the drivers of forest loss in the Amazon are, you know, clearly mostly agribusiness. You have the large scale, you know, farms, you know, wholesale conversion to cattle pasture. Whereas in the Congo Basin countries, a lot of it is really, you know, small farmers eking out a livelihood on the edge of the forest. So the solutions are going to be completely different between the one environment and the other. And so that's, I guess, a first answer. Where there is poverty-driven deforestation, there's a huge heavy lift that those societies need to make in transforming the rural livelihood opportunities, as well as just the models of agriculture, so that they don't depend on replacing the forest, and so that people can make a good living by, you know, farming in the same place, but also getting other kinds of employment in rural areas. And that involves, you know, rural electrification and which can be done with renewable energy. But it also may involve some degree of, you know, so-called payments for ecosystem services where, you know, we actually compensate rural communities for protecting the forests. And so that some of their income stream comes from, you know, that source of revenue, so that they don't have to choose between feeding their kids or cutting down the forest. And there are some successful experiments with doing that. And in a way, this mechanism I mentioned for paying tropical countries for reductions in deforestation under the Paris Agreement is like an international version of that. You know, you actually have a revenue stream. Right now, all the incentives are in the other direction. You know, you get more tax revenue for cutting down the forest, you get more voters for cutting down the forest, you get, you know, you name it. So we got to switch those incentives. And I think institutions like the World Bank, and also now that the US is sort of back at the table in these things through our agencies like USAID, can help in many ways, in both in providing the underlying analysis about the economic value of protecting a forest for things like disaster control or drinking water, all these invisible things that tend to be valued at zero when government is planning a road or a plantation. And by the way, this is going on steroids right now as part of COVID recovery. because there are all these billions of dollars being shoveled out, you know, of development finance institutions for the worthy objective of COVID, you know, pandemic economic crisis relief, but a lot of it's being invested in business as usual type infrastructure that's going to be bad news for forests. So we really need those public institutions to help do the analysis and tote up the benefits that are invisible currently for things like, you know, climate control and, you know, flood control and other services that are gotten from forests. Briefly on the urban areas, there's tons that can be done to make urban living better using that and so-called nature-based solutions. And, you know, again, part of it is inertia. You know, city planners and engineers, they know how to build, you know, a sewage plant, or they know how to build this kind of thing. And changing their mindsets about how to solve a particular problem in a more nature-friendly way and harnessing nature is just one of those, you know, moving the tanker kind of challenges that a lot of people are working on, but it involves, like, you know, training everybody through the chain of finance about how to finance the kind of intervention that we have right here in DC, where it was financed through an innovative mechanism that rewarded, the financiers if the city, was successful in reducing the stormwater runoff. So there's just a lot of different levers that we can pull, and I'm not convinced we're pulling all of them yet.
Thank you. I know it's a very broad question, and it seems like the problem is so multifaceted.
Well, we have a question closer to home right now. Greg wanted to know, do you have a singular top piece of advice for this Palisades Village audience? Specifically, what should modest income Palisades residents do between now and the end of 2021?
Mhm.
I think there's, we can do 3 things. First of all of the individual actions that we can take in terms of planting native plants in our yards, participating in the work days where you free the trees along the Potomac from exotic vines. All those things not only make a difference, but I think sort of build a sense of solidarity psychologically, but also in the community. So definitely do what you can do literally in your own backyard. The second is exercising the power of your consumption decisions, and proactively choosing to purchase, if you got to buy a new dining room table, make sure it's sustainably certified wood. And building this house, I have to say, I was just shocked how many times in conversations with the architect or the builder or the vendors of various products, I would be asking for the environmentally friendly or the climate friendly product, and they would look at me puzzled and say, "You're the first person who's ever asked," And so I think there's a lot of headroom for all of us to collectively communicate in our consumption decisions that we want the environmentally friendly alternative. And then the last thing we can do is exercise our voices and votes as citizens, and make it clear to our elected officials, should we ever get them from Districts of Columbia residents, that we care about climate change, and that's a priority issue for us in what we expect our elected officials to prioritize, both in US domestic policy, but also projecting it on the global stage.
Wonderful. I think, Elaine, do you have a question?
Yeah. Am I muted? No. Okay. Yes, thank you so much. I thought your presentation was wonderful, and coming from a tropical country who did very well, against all odds, like I say, because we were a miracle in development with tourism, etc.
Costa Rica?
Now, my country is the island of Mauritius.
Oh, Mauritius, okay.
And now, with no tourists, unfortunately, all the people who have land and the developers are so eager to grab any piece of land and real estate, and do exactly what you've done here, gated communities, malls, as if in Mauritius, which is a bit poor anyway, you have a few people who can go to malls. We are building malls all over, and now even more. And I'm trying to tell them, because I have a group of friends, and they don't get it. So, because we are not informed, we don't know what's the business people focus on only profit. And I'm telling them, I'm not only talking about carbon, no carbon. I'm talking about it can be profitable as well. Not to, and then forest, for example, my son is really interested in all these ecological forests. He's been in Peru now for all of Latin America, so he knows all that. And I can't get through to them. So, because the government is not going to do anything. The government in all these countries are corrupt. Let's be clear about it. If they can see some kind of advantage, we're going to tell it. But it's the private sector, people, as you say, in agribusiness. There's a lot of, for example, in all these countries, sugar is not making any money anymore. All right, so what are they, and nobody's telling them what else to do. And what else to do when it's so much easier to go and build and get quick money. And all these agricultural land are now being built with a lot of carbon emission. and roads that they were trying to do. So I don't know what is the way to internationally, how do they get to these people who are people who make decisions, and how to get it that it's not only real estate. Like here next to me, I had a small house. They did a mega house. I don't know how they got the permit, and they didn't leave any space on their side to plant. So I've been planting all evergreens all around because there's nothing there. They've taken so much land, and DC government, I tried to fight it. I said, you're not allowed to do that. Is it so near? No, no, no. If it's low, you can do it. Meaning they did window well, they could do it. And they did also an enormous staircase to go down to the basement, which is even too big. You don't need that. And DC government are giving permit because the bigger the house, the bigger. So it's just the money mentality. And as you saw, I saw in the one of the slides you showed, from 1916, the emission went up. It had gone down before. So what to do?
Well, you've also asked a sweeping question. I think you're right that, private developers are going to do what they can get away with, right? So we really do have to depend on public regulation, and to get good public regulation, whether it's here in the district or, in another country, it's going to depend on, civic action, citizens to demand. I do think that international institutions like the World Bank can play an important role in communicating what the nature of the trade-offs are, and and actually doing, authoritative economic analysis about alternative ways of doing things. And so something that's very interesting to me, just a month ago, the International Monetary Fund, of all people, published a working paper showing that investments in protecting nature and wildlife were actually better stimulus investments in terms of creating, jobs and everything, than the traditional like agribusiness expansion in the investments in the land sector. Man, if the IMF is saying that,
But the IFC is giving money to develop little industries.
Yeah. So there's
I'd love to have
a lot
that
of work to
paper
do.
of IMF actually.
Yeah.
It's on the web, you think, probably?
Yes. Yes.
Application.
Yep. It's something about, if you Googled, IMF working paper, conservation stimulus, something, you'd probably find it.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting, because I'm going to send that to them too. Because I think it's a question of information. The information is not getting through.
Yeah.
To those who could really decide.
Oh, I think that's right. And people who have been trained in microeconomics 30 years ago, who are running the world right now, they don't, they think of nature as sort of a luxury good that you do after you're, after you've got development and you're wealthy. And I don't mean to cast aspersions on all microeconomists, but, when I talk to people who work in these institutions, the sense is that, they haven't gotten the email yet about, how all these things really need to be integrated into mainstream decision making.
Yeah, I know. In my case, some people say, well, I don't understand anything of that. I don't know. They're not going to into bother, because it's so much easier just to build houses.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
I have a question. You have dedicated your life to protecting forests, and the ongoing worldwide deforestation must be very painful for you, Francis. And yet you have this very positive, energetic sense that we can make a difference, and that your work can make a difference. Can you close by describing that to us?
Sure. Well, I think there's two answers to that. One is, the alternative is abject despair, So you just have to kind of choose to be optimistic and look for reasons for hope. But the other thing, and this is important for me, personally, is that, my father was a white Baptist minister in the South for his life. And he, you know, his sort of éblouissement when he was in divinity school at Yale was that the civil rights issue and racial injustice was the biggest problem facing our society, and he needed to do something about it. So he dedicated his life, and this, you know, would have been back
Yes.
in the 40s,
Yes.
dedicated his life to trying to, you know, push the boundaries of civil rights and the racial justice issue. And over his career, he you know, did that, and gay rights and aging rights, and, you know, all these things. And, you know, in the course of, you know, the schools in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where I grew up, you know, integrated when I was in the 3rd grade. And before my father died last year, you know, he had the opportunity to come and attend Obama's first inauguration with my husband, Mike. And, you know, he just thought, you know, that it was unimaginable to, you know, would have been unimaginable to him in the 40s that we could have elected an African-American, you know, president of the United States. So I think about the environmental and climate challenges in that way. Well, maybe it's unimaginable that we could stop deforestation in my lifetime, but hey,
Yes.
you know, Dad lived to see, you know, huge change. Not that it's over, but, you know, big difference that maybe I can live to see that kind of tipping point where people finally get it, you know, about the importance of nature in our lives, and we'll actually start doing something about it.
That's such a great response. Thank you, Frances. Thank you. I think, are there any more questions? Well, I want to thank Frances. This has been such a thought-provoking and challenging and urgent talk. And I can't thank you enough for inspiring us to be better stewards of the trees in our own neighborhood, and to advocate for them with our own city government, but also advocate for our forests. I feel like I'm leaving deeply inspired and fired up and ready to do something. So
well, thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure, and I feel honored by the presence of all of you and your great questions. It's a lot of fun.
Thank you, everybody. So if you've enjoyed tonight's presentation, everybody, please join us on May 19th